Happy St. Patrick's Day, everybody. To celebrate, we're going to be looking at the life of St. Patrick in a little bit of a different light as an exemplar of the religious or the saintly miracle worker, and how such a concept as that may help modern spiritual practitioners have a greater understanding and appreciation for some of the classic saints and sages of the different religious traditions, despite the fact that many modern practitioners no longer strictly identify with those religious traditions. So that's what we're going to be looking at in today's video. Hope you enjoy, and please make sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Thank you. St. Patrick was a miracle worker of rare caliber in the history of the church, who can stand on par with many of the world's greatest spiritual masters throughout history and from all different traditions and religions. So today, in honor of him and St. Patrick's Day, I thought it would be interesting to look a little bit at the concept of religious sainthood, and especially the saintly miracle worker. In today's kind of modern spiritual climate, many practitioners have distanced themselves from organized religion, and for admittedly some important reasons. The classic moral stances and legal stances of many of the world's organized religions tend to clash with a lot of today's values and with a lot of today's philosophies about what life is really about, what we're here for. But nonetheless, in doing that, and many people kind of separating themselves a little bit from organized religion, what's happened is a almost uniform disregard of the very rich spiritual traditions that are within those religions, and especially the kind of miraculous ability and phenomena that surround some of the great saints. Now, of course, not all saints were seemingly particularly good people. Some people achieve sainthood in the church simply because of their profound role in developing the church, such as the fathers of the church and the early doctrinal authorities, some for martyrdom, and so on and so forth. And there are some saints who seem to have a bit of a sketchy history and record. But St. Patrick falls under the category, such as St. Francis and St. Xavier, of these kind of profound missionaries who, in the process of their missionary work, ended up working astounding miracles. And as spiritual practitioners in today's world, I feel that it's important to not completely disregard that fact and act as though simply because we have a distaste for maybe the religion or some of the particular stances of that religious ideology, we therefore need to have a kind of universal disavowalment of all the saints and sages of that tradition. That really makes no sense whatsoever. And in fact, I think that this issue of sainthood needs to be looked at much more deeply by modern practitioners, because in a lot of ways it goes against the modern spiritual rhetoric that enlightenment and spiritual perfection is very methodic and systematic, and it's something that we can have techniques for. And even many of the spiritual traditions that teach about miracles, like in the yogic and the tantric traditions in India and Tibet and throughout China, these traditions approach miraculous feats as somewhat being very systematic, as being the result of particular divine knowledge, implementing it in certain ways, training your visualization and concentration, entering into different samadhis, into some of the different jhanas, and learning how to master things like the elements and space and time, so on and so forth. What I find incredibly interesting about these kind of deeply religious miracle workers is often we have no reason whatsoever to believe that they had any kind of method, any kind of absolute laid down step by step, this is what you do in order to achieve spiritual perfection. Instead, these saints, like St. Francis, like St. Xavier, like St. Patrick, and even in other religious traditions, such as in the Sufi and the Muslim traditions, we have great authorities like Qadir al-Jilani, we have great authorities like Muhyiddin Chishti. When we look at these religious miracle workers, there isn't necessarily, I mean, there's a method in a sense to how religious perfection is understood within that religious tradition. But it's not like St. Patrick was sitting there doing, pranayama. St. Patrick wasn't sitting there meditating on the mountain when he was doing his austerities, holding his breath for really long periods of time trying to open his kundalini. But what was happening while St. Patrick was in retreat on a mountain that is now called St. Patrick's Mountain is angels were descending to teach him. He was actually learning different aspects of the divine mysteries and the sacramental mysteries from spiritual beings. St. Patrick himself did some miracles at one point. I believe it's in his Confessions. I can't quite remember where I read it. He mentions that he was worried about letting the people around him see the full extent of his miraculous power, because he was worried that the pagans would set him up as a god and it would end up interfering with his missionary work. And this was, even despite that, it was still an issue he faced of different pagan groups setting up places of remembrance of him, even while he was alive. And he would have to go and try to take those things down and get them to stop, because they didn't understand his divine powers. We're talking about a person here who entered into a largely pagan country without a military, without huge armed troops to forcefully convert people at the sword. He didn't conquer the country through any kind of material way. He conquered the country spiritually, and through the performance of miracles that it was simply difficult to understand. There's, I think, 33 reincarnations attested to, for example, on the part of St. Patrick. And even if he didn't do all 33, if he just did one or two, not reincarnation, resurrection, if he just did one or two resurrections, that's a pretty profound accomplishment. We have many demonstrations of what are classically called Siddhis, if we use the the kind of Sanskrit term, the sense of perfection, spiritual perfections. As a being reaches certain levels of spiritual development, maturity, and perfection, there seem to be some supernatural things start to happen around them. And this is attested to in every spiritual tradition around the whole world. And we see this in St. Patrick's life, that as he reaches different degrees of spiritual perfection, he begins to have many visions of the future. He often knew what was going to happen. In fact, he got himself out of a number of important life and death situations from these visions. The first of which begins when he was still just a young man. He had been, many people don't know this about St. Patrick, he was captured as a slave when he was 16 years old, and some of his family members as well. They were sold into slavery by pirates, and he actually was a slave for 5 or 6 years. And then he had a dream one night of a being coming and telling him, to kind of take faith. He was going to be able to escape. If he tried to escape now, it would succeed. And the angel even said, there's a boat waiting for you in this harbor when you get there. And he escaped. He had to travel 200 miles on foot. And when he finally got to the harbor, there the boat was. And the people who were running the boat just happened to be like, hey, yeah, come on, we'll let you on. And he ended up getting passage, I believe, back to England at that time. So even at a young age, he began having some interesting prophetic insights regularly throughout his life. He would demonstrate his prophetic ability and insight. There are testaments or testimonies of him being able to speak to people at a great distance as though he was right next to them, of knowing the languages of different people even when he didn't speak the language, of bilocation and other phenomena often associated with the saints. He once made a fire on Passover to help prepare for Easter. He made a fire, and apparently the fire couldn't be put out. The different pagan groups and the Celts and the Druids were trying to put the fire out any way they could. In fact, the local king had actually said that you guys need to put his fire out by the end of the evening. And everybody was trying, and nobody could put out the fire that Patrick lit. There's some of the instances of resurrection are extraordinary. St. Patrick is one of the few saints attested to have resurrected people who had long since been dead, not people who just died a few days ago, were still in their funeral shrouds or anything like that. He was attested on a few occasions, one famous one when he approached a war band that was sent there to kill him, and he was traveling with his group of monks. And he said, if I perform like a great miracle for you, if I resurrect somebody, will you save us? Will you spare us and accept this religion, accept this way? And they said yes, but they wanted to be in charge of who he resurrected. They had heard he could work miracles. So they went and dug up these old, like 200 or 300-year-old graves and brought these piles of bones to Patrick. And Patrick, St. Patrick actually brought life back out of these bones. And apparently those people went and lived full lives afterwards. His knowledge of people's hearts, of discerning spirits. I mean, he demonstrates in his life many of the Siddhis, many of the classic major and minor Siddhis of Indian and Oriental tradition. Yet what I find so interesting about saints of that kind of spiritual caliber as St. Patrick is, again, they're doing this without a set method. St. Patrick wasn't waking up his kundalini. He didn't chant a good Bij mantra, right? He wasn't rousing up, the chakras or anything like that. He didn't cultivate energy in his dantian and circulate it into the extraordinary meridians. It doesn't really matter which school of thought you try to approach, or from which different more methodic yogic or tantric tradition you try to use. The miraculous power of the saints is somewhat ineffable. And that's what I find so interesting about it as a spiritual practitioner, is that the root of it seems to be ineffable. And I think this is kind of an important thing for modern practitioners to contemplate and to try to understand. Many people in modern spirituality have an aversion to the whole concept of God. And if they use a concept of God, it's often been somewhat translated into Buddhist or Taoist or yogic terms and understandings of an ultimate reality that is ethically neutral and morally neutral. That isn't really a living, vivid, thoughtful intelligence the way that we often see in Western monotheistic literature. And I think that to some extent, a lot of modern practitioners, because of this aversion to these classic concepts of God, have also created an aversion to prayer. And this is where I think a big issue has happened in modern spirituality. Because prayer is one of the unifying mechanisms of all the world's religious traditions and all the world's spiritual traditions. And it's one of the few unifying factors between all the different great saints, the saints who are performing their miracles without seeming to use particular methods and exact scientific or yogic and tantric approaches. One thing that they all have in common is prayer. And interesting enough, this is one thing all the classic traditions have in common. But prayer has become a very controversial issue. I remember I was giving a teaching to a group of people once, and I started talking a little bit about prayer, and you could feel like the tension rise in the room. You could feel everyone get uncomfortable the moment I started talking about traditional concepts of prayer, just praying from your heart to a consciousness or reality that transcends your own personal consciousness and reality. And people tend to be quite uncomfortable about that, which I found odd, because if you actually go to the world's spiritual centers, if you go to India, you go to Tibet, you go to the Chinese Taoist temples, you go and hang out with cave yogis in the Himalayas, they're pretty much all praying. Yet when you go to modern spiritual events and modern spiritual teachings and yoga classes and things of the sort, there's no prayer anywhere. Maybe some people chant a little bit of japa because they think that this particular mantra will give them power or give them wealth or give them success. But you don't see prayer really in Western spirituality now. The way that you see it in all of the roots of modern spirituality. If you take modern spirituality and Western spirituality to its roots, and you look at how Buddhism influenced modern practice, yoga influenced modern practice, different ways Taoism has influenced us, as well as Platonism and Christianity, all these different spiritual traditions that have kind of come together in the modern spiritual climate, they all have prayer in common. And if you go to their temples, if you go to their masjids, if you spend time with the swamis and with the different yogis and high-level practitioners, they're praying a lot. Prayer is a pillar of their path. And I think it's because there's something somewhat ineffable to prayer. There's something that, in a way, defines our ability to approach it, limit it, define it, and turn it into some kind of spiritual chemical formula that we can use to always recreate certain results or to elevate ourselves step by step. There's something kind of peculiar and mysterious and strange to prayer, that because it should just be talking to yourself, right? If we look at it just totally rationally, prayer should just be having a conversation with yourself. Yet despite that, it would be strange to say that these saints gained their miraculous power by having deep, thoughtful conversations with themselves, right? There seems to be something elevating, something what we call anagogic, something uplifting and elevating, divinizing in prayer, in meaningful, intense prayer, the kind of prayer that you lose yourself in, the kind of prayer that you lose even your own identity in, that you lose your goals in, that you can just disappear into. That kind of prayer seems to be full of, like Plato would say, and especially Proclus and some of the greater Platonists later on, would say that that kind of prayer contains perfecting reasonings within it. It contains ideas where it doesn't matter what's coming out of your lips. It doesn't matter what's coming out of your mouth. There's some kind of perfective contemplative process happening within you that the prayer is just a manifestation of. And somehow the prayer can help excite that and lift one up in ecstasy and in different spiritual states, and even lead to degrees of spiritual perfection. And I think that the lives of the saints are particularly exemplary of this. And that modern practitioners shouldn't uniformly disavow themselves of all these amazing spiritual figures and authorities simply because the religious beliefs at that time or cultural values of that time do not reflect today's cultural values. Because if we do that, if we end up rejecting all of them, then in the process we often reject the central tool and power that they used. And this ends up revolving a lot around the power of the heart, the power of love, the power of faith, the power of prayer, all of which are important parts of just the human psyche. People tend to really only grow deeply and meaningfully when they're out of their comfort zone. And something that I worry about with many modern spiritual practitioners is that the modern spiritual climate is one of incredible comfort. It's one of incredible leisure. It is one where there's not a lot of struggle anymore, there's not a lot of strain, there's not a lot of hardship. And in some ways there's some beautiful things that come out of that. But in other ways it ends up detrimenting us, because we don't push ourselves. We don't push ourselves psychologically, and we don't push ourselves spiritually. And one of the things that I think has happened in the relationship of modern practitioners to some of these classic religious traditions and some of these more religious saints and miracle workers is that it is a little too uncomfortable. It's a little bit past our comfort zone to deal with some of the ideas or some of the implications of what a being like St. Patrick or St. Francis Xavier, or more recently, for example, Padre Pio, the great 20th century saint and miracle worker. I think that many modern practitioners have a hard time accepting or even really looking into the lives of those beings, because the implications of it might be a little bit troublesome. The implication that somebody like Padre Pio could reach such a high level of spiritual perfection by praying to a concept of God that many modern spiritual practitioners find somewhat divisive and conflictive and even rationally absurd in some ways. Yet nonetheless a high degree of spiritual perfection seems to manifest, and that challenges our worldviews. And that's something that practitioners have to constantly experience, is a challenging of your worldviews. If the worldviews of a spiritual tradition become far too comfortable and unchallenged, then the people stop making progress. Spirituality isn't about being incredibly comfortable where you're at. It's about constantly trying to expand your horizons, to broaden your view, to develop profound respect for the different mysteries and spiritual teachings of the world, and to continue to push the envelope of your own comfort zone so that you can continue to grow as a person. And I'm hoping that today's little foray into St. Patrick and into the kind of power and some of the interesting aspects of the lives of these saints and the spiritual perfection that these saints end up achieving. I hope this little foray has been maybe beneficial and maybe helped in some way expand some people's horizons. Hope you enjoyed the video, and I look forward to talking to everybody again soon with our next video. Thank you.